It's just tomorrow is like
I'm curious what email version said we like to shift with people one time.
yeah, that's the only part. I was surprised ours was not. It's usually the other way around.
If it's easier for me.
Yeah, I know.
All over. Lack of nutrition.
Yeah.
I don't know if you like
It did cross my mind. We haven't said anything.
I'm very curious about that.
Good reminder.
But I'm assuming that's.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for our Institute for Sustainability and Resilience Biocultural Initiative of the Pacific Seminar Series. This is our third talk of the semester. Dr. Kavika Winter's talk was rescheduled for April 22nd.
Birthday.
Your birthday?
Birthday.
Birthday.
Earth's birthday.
Birthday. That's perfect. For those of you unfamiliar with Institute for Sustainability and Resilience, we are an institute that works to coordinate research and curriculum around sustainability across campus. And recently, we've been able to form a partnership with the Biocultural Initiative. So the Biocultural Initiative is now part of ISR, and so we are featuring them through the seminar series. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Tamara Tickton, one of the leads of Biocultural Initiative, to introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Nākoa.
Yeah, so we're super excited to have Dr. Nākoa Farrant here with us today. He is an ʻŌiwi scientist and assistant professor in the School of Life Sciences here at Nākoa. I've been involved with and inspired by momona ʻāina initiatives across the country. By combining Kānaka ʻŌiwi and institutional knowledge systems, his research aims to inform stewardship that achieves conservation goals while supporting the social needs of communities. And he's just started in January, so he's brand new here, and we're super excited to have him in our department, and especially a part of our biocultural initiative. So the first thing we did when he came on board was ask him to come and give a talk. So really grateful for this. And
Yeah, mahalo everyone for coming and making time and inviting me to present here. Really exciting, grateful to be here. I hope everyone, we're in kind of hectic times. I mean, Hawaiʻi's weathered plenty of storms before, but always gonna shock different communities and some that continue to get hit. So I hope you're finding ways to take care of yourselves, and I'm sure any of you thoughtful people are finding ways to support others as well. So the title of my presentation today is Fostering ʻāina momona on former plantation fields through biocultural stewardship. My journey as a researcher and in some of this work really began, I grew up in Paumalu, modern day Sunset Beach area. And a lot of my middle school, high school years, especially on community work days and at other times too, I would go to Lokoʻea, this Lokoʻia, this fish pond in modern day Haleiwa. And it was a great place to get the hands-on experience of engaging with community and ʻāina, learning about how our kupuna designed these systems to increase abundance by leveraging the existing flows of water and nutrients and energy on the landscape. And at the same time, I was in high school at Kamehameha Kapalama, and I was having opportunities to think about my first science research projects and had some support to do that and pursue that in this Lokoʻia. And so I wanted to find a way to try to connect the two, and thinking about these phytoplankton at some of the base of the food chain in a Lokoʻia that's undergoing restoration. I was running along some transects, doing some plankton tows and looking at that kind of distribution in with respect to different physical properties of the water. And while that research isn't necessarily like super groundbreaking, it was this great opportunity to think about how I could conduct research in a way that was focused on contributing to community efforts, especially around cultural restoration. And it kind of informed some of my journey that followed in an internship a few years later at Paepaeʻo Heʻeia, where there were opportunities to learn about various aspects of restoring local i'a, from, recreating makaha out of mangrove and processes of uhahumu pohaku and building hale, and also opportunities to engage the next generation in tours and educational activities and participate kind of probably unknowingly at the time in conversations that contributed to the first round of Kulana Noi'i, this kind of framework that Rosie Allegado and others led the charge on creating for helping many researchers better engage and build relationships with community organizations. And so those were phenomenal experiences. And just by spending more time on the ground there, I also had opportunities to think about, again, not how me doing research and a lot of the institutional research methods I was being trained in could be showing anything that, we didn't already know in terms of how our kupuna thought about and designed these systems, but hopefully recognizing that there's been a lot of the break in our relationship to how we malama ʻāina and understand how we can conduct that in the modern context. And so while I was there, I was just having lunch one day with Keahi Pi'iohia, one of the kia'i there, and looking at these old pictures and thinking about, they were at a place in the restoration process. I guess this was around 2017, where they were thinking about where they might restore this pua pond that kind of is a subsection of the interior of He'eia fish pond, where you would focus on an area for promoting the reproduction of young and raising of the young pua. And so just through a technique I had learned in a kind of imagery analysis and some reference lengths that we knew from other parts of the image, I was able to generate an estimate of where this pua pond intersected with the wall, kind of pointed at in the arrows here. And we went out and measured and walked the wall and kind of found that it really aligned with what Keahi had previously, well before we had any of this conversation, identified as what he called a ku stone, this kind of distinct large pohaku that had stood the test of time and had some distinct coloring. And so it's just one of these clearly memorable and chicken skin moments of thinking about how we can uncover some of the ike that our kupuna left behind and opportunities to apply some of these modern tools as we think about stewardship now and in the future. And in the years that have occurred since, I've been super grateful to spend a lot of time in community and different types of local lo'i and mala and learn across all of these different contexts and see how community comes together. And Kavika and so many others who passed through these halls have conducted research that, of course, many of us have witnessed firsthand of how these ongoing biocultural restoration efforts are capable of achieving conservation goals, as well as so much more. They're restoring critical habitat that mimics the existing structures across the environment, but also amplifies opportunities for flora and fauna, especially those of cultural importance and sometimes endangered and threatened species. And a lot of this restoration effort is guided by ʻāina, the specific water and communities in each space, and how that's what's enabled a lot of this biocultural restoration to occur. At the time I kind of was starting this work, I was also really inspired by seeing papers from Natalie Kurashima and others who really highlighted the potential for biocultural restoration across the Paiāina. And in this particular paper, highlighting how it's still very feasible under future climate scenarios, but at the same time, we aren't seeing super widespread biocultural restoration. So there's clearly a lot of barriers that persist. And I can't get into all of them. The one that I kind of focus on in a lot of my research is understanding the role of former plantations in really transforming Hawaiʻi across several different dimensions. And, in some ways, their legacies continuing to present barriers to widespread biocultural restoration today. And so obviously, many in this room are probably familiar with some of the aspects of history of plantations, and we're not going to deep dive into too much of that nuance today. But, from the mid 1800s onward, we have a lot of plantation interest expanding here in Hawaii for sugarcane and pineapple, and then pasture land, which I focus on less in my work. But that results in these dramatic changes in the landscape, ecologically clearing a forest to make way for these fields. These business interests played a big role in pressures across decades to ultimately overthrow the kingdom and create opportunities for shifting from this relationship of kinship and caring for ʻāina to one of ownership and kind of dividing up land and removing people to create pursue your economic opportunities on plantations. A lot of water diversions for more than a century of hundreds of millions of gallons a day, often from the eastern sides of our islands to irrigate these fields, and now to irrigate golf courses and new housing developments, among other things. And then, of course, also various demographic shifts that resulted from the plantation era as well. This just briefly shows you some of the key points of how, over time, factors that may have played a role in the decline of plantations were at times labor unions eventually strengthening. I mean, of course, still subpar conditions that workers face, and there, maybe had some small wins that ultimately hurt plantation profits over time. Eventually, in the late 80s and 90s, some of the agricultural subsidies that existed at a federal level were ending, and that kind of made it less economically feasible. And then you also have the rise in tourism and now more like residential ventures as well, interested in these kinds of lands, that have played a role in the trajectory of and decline of these plantation activities over the last century. And so today you have a lot of plantation lands that are housing developments, some areas in new crops, and about half of the former plantation lands, specifically sugarcane and pineapple fields, that are really not being actively managed in a lot of cases. And as most of these plantations have closed in recent decades, many of these areas have remained unmanaged, and there's been a lot of negative impacts that have resulted from that. We see lasting legacies even in this kind of post-active plantation agricultural era. I mean, there's still some plantation activity, as you'll see, but you could have areas that remain bare when fields are unmanaged for long periods of time, like result in soil erosion, especially during high water events, high rainfall events, whether that's this week in areas that are downstream of agricultural land in like Waialua area, and in years past near Lahaina following fires and changes there. And of course, there's other potential concerns in addition to just nutrient runoff into homes or onto reefs. There might be other commercial chemicals that are the result of that agricultural legacy that are present as well. Even if areas do revegetate, often we're seeing the spread of these introduced grasses that were brought over for pasture and grazing, spreading. They spread rapidly and grow and succeed in these highly disturbed conditions, but they're also, unfortunately, this prime risk for fire as well. And so here you can kind of see the work of Clay Trauernicht and some work that I've been able to collaborate on with him and others at the university, highlighting how, in general, there's been an increase in burned area over the past century. There's it's not a clear trend, but I think that it's kind of pretty clear that there's a trend of increased fire, especially in the decades following most of these plantation lands closing. I'm sure there's a number of factors kind of that could be contributing to that, but I think one of them is that we have this opportunity for widespread invasive species, invasive vegetation to spread, this kind of grass fire cycle in which during a rainy season, we were just talking about in a separate conversation, you can see this opportunity for these kinds of grasses to spread really quickly, accumulate a lot of biomass if there is drought, whether it's the summer immediately after or the next summer. You, as a result, have a lot of this accumulated biomass that's now dry, and it's kind of cured as fuel to be ready for a fire to occur under the wrong kind of conditions of a spark occurring or high winds also simultaneously occurring. Once a fire happens, these grasses are often among the most successful invaders. And so you kind of have this reinforcing cycle of fire. And so after the fire in Lahaina, it's something that I think is visually apparent probably to many of us in conversations that were had in a number of pieces, but to my knowledge at that point, there hadn't been anyone really quantifying really the spatial relationship between former agricultural lands of different types and burned area. And so that's what this is illustrating, just the amount of burned area in each year associated with these different former agricultural land types. Pasture just by area is a very large contributor. And so that's one thing that's being shown here, but you can also see instances of high amounts of burned area. And over this 24-year period, the overwhelming majority of the area that was burned was associated with former agricultural lands. And so the goal of this research that I'm going to share with you today was really thinking about how we can overcome some of these legacies of plantations and where could biocultural restoration be prioritized on former plantation lands to enhance ʻāina momona, these what we see being what we know existed for centuries before and what we see different community groups mobilizing to work to create this abundance of resources and food and all we need is communities culturally and socially. And so the former plantation lands here in Hawaii are part of a global trend that is being driven by a variety of factors that we can't go into today, but it's just to say that there is a large amount of former agricultural land being unmanaged globally. There's been interest as a result in thinking about how those types of lands could be strategically managed, whether you're thinking about opportunities to produce food or store more carbon for your climate goals. These kinds of studies have highlighted that there could very well be potential on this kind of former agricultural land to, say, meet some of these global types of sustainable development goals. And so that kind of led me first to think about some of the types of like sustainable development goals we have here in Hawaii. These are just some examples of those that were really objectives made for kind of coming up on time here for them to happen. And I don't think we're going to reach these kinds of goals, but to like double food production or achieve carbon neutrality in these next several years or decades. And so we similarly are thinking about how we can meet all of these different goals and also do it in a way that aligns with our cultural values here in Hawaii. All over the world, and especially in a place like here in Hawaii, we have limited land availability to try to achieve all of these different goals. And so you have these competing interests and trade-offs and often in how you think about where you might allocate areas to reforest, to store carbon, and maybe provide habitat for species, but also you maybe often aren't thinking about those as like key agricultural lands, or at least that's one common lens of thinking about it. And this picture on the left kind of illustrates that, where you might think, if you just think about reforestation for the sake of carbon storage, you could achieve that, but how can pursuing a more biocultural informed approach achieve some of that carbon storage while also providing a range of cultural resources and food and more diverse, structural habitat for species as well. But we often don't see things like biocultural restoration being considered when in context of like land use planning. And for example, the type of study I showed earlier regarding like strategic areas for food production or carbon storage. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I mean, for one, it's like familiarity with the types of factors that are involved with making biocultural restoration feasible and how you factor that into your models. And that's one thing I kind of try to address with this approach here. And so, in one case, you might have the more institutional, academically informed approaches that would apply more land use optimization models and be grounded in more spatial analyses from GIS or integrating remote sensing data. They have a lot of advantages in that they're scalable and transferable across contexts, but they might overlook the needs of communities and are less equipped to think about where you might prioritize things like biocultural restoration. And then you have a more community-informed approach to thinking about priority uses and areas for those uses on former plantation lands in this context. And that, in my case, could be informed by community interviews, thinking about the past practices of land stewardship in those areas. This is a great way to try to elevate community voices and cultural values in thinking about land use planning decisions, but also requires time and then community connections that you are nurturing over time. There's also challenges with synthesizing quantitative and qualitative data types that I try to address here to some extent, but yeah, that also is a challenge, and why blending these different schools of knowledge and methodological approaches can be a challenge at times. And so I'll kind of start and walk through some of the two different approaches and working towards bridging them over the course of the rest of this talk. And so starting with the more common academic, institutional / like urban conservation planner type lens, you might start from a place of looking at the types of spatial data, such as the potential yields that have been modeled. In this case, I looked at the potential yields of sweet potato being a historically, culturally important crop here. And in this context being the rain-fed potential of yields for that particular crop, just because water at times can be, as we know, a very contentious issue and potential limiting factor in the feasibility of restoration. So I wanted to explore what types of yields are theoretically attainable on former plantation lands in that rain-fed type of context. And then also looking at the modeled potential for carbon storage through a reforestation type route on former plantation lands. And so effectively each plantation field has its modeled potential for food production or carbon storage, and it also has a cost associated with it. In this case, I was looking at the evaluated costs for tax records. There's some flaws in applying that type of cost metric, and effectively this optimization model is exploring the pros and cons, doing some form of cost benefit analysis of whether a given parcel, given its costs, is worth considering being included as a priority area, as well as whether it's more appropriate to use for food production or carbon storage based on these model data that I introduced before. And so this map, we're not going to go into like the deep details of each little facet of it, but it kind of illustrates the output of that type of modeled approach. And so these former plantation lands that I'd identified previously through looking at agricultural maps and changes in where areas were not cultivated and were not otherwise managed over time were allocated to either be used for recultivation or reforestation, shown in the orange or green respectively. And they were kind of gridded at 1 hectare scale, so 100 meters by 100 meters. And so, even just from a cursory look, you can see that some of these areas, for example, on like the Hamakua coast of Hawaiʻi Island, are being noted as potential areas for reforestation. But you can also look at areas on Lanai that were, highly regarded for recultivation by this model. And there's things to think about there just from a quick social standpoint of like, is there the labor force to do that? And what would be involved with distribution if you chose to do that? And so while maybe useful as a first pass, this model overlooks some key social and other barriers to the feasibility of some of these types of future uses of former plantation lands. I then proceeded from here to apply a more refined grid. You might see areas where there's a mix of orange and green kind of in close proximity. And so I actually need to track back real quick. So the initial analysis was done at 1/4 of a hectare scale. And I applied then a bigger grid over it, a 1 hectare scale grid on top of it, to identify areas where there was a mix of reforestation and recultivation in close proximity to each other. And so these are areas that, again, a not particularly well-informed individual approaching this could be like, these are areas where you could think about multi-objective land management, whether that's some modern approach of agroforestry or something else like that, where you could see opportunities of areas being well suited for a mix of reforestation or recultivation together. One thing to note here is you really don't narrow it down much. Like, a lot of these areas are considered appropriate for a variety of different uses. And, it doesn't tell you a whole lot to say, like, this is where biocultural restoration should happen, like all across Hawaii. And as we know too, biocultural restoration is really steeped in the work of community and the generational knowledge they have, the relationships they have to place. And so that's really critical to understanding where biocultural restoration might actually be a priority on former plantation lands. And so now shifting to think about applying a more community-based approach to identifying priorities for former plantation lands. I conducted some interviews to characterize the relationships that different people involved with biocultural restoration have to ʻāina and how those relationships inform their priorities for the use of plantation lands. And so from October of 2023 through February of 2024, I conducted conversations predominantly with Kānaka ʻŌiwi and one kama'aina across Hawaii. The goal was to try to get representation across Hawaii. Maui was fairly recently in the aftermath of the fires, and so it was a little bit more challenging to get that representation. And people were really recruited through a snowballing-based approach in which I have my contacts and people I've built pilina with across Hawaii, and then they kind of would suggest, especially as I was interested in getting a range of perspectives across different types of biocultural restoration initiatives and across the ʻāina, identifying people I might reach out to. And of course, only a certain number of people had time or were interested. But I was grateful to have this level of engagement. And these individuals are either leading or otherwise pretty heavily engaged with biocultural restoration, which I was pursuing because as a result, they would have some expertise in understanding the opportunities and challenges for biocultural restoration, specifically on former plantation land. And so as others who have done interviews know, the questions can go and build into a lot more than just this, but if I'm going to try to convey in a simple way, the kind of one aspect of the questions was focused on understanding how these community members are interacting with and relating to ʻāina, and then how do those interactions inform their priorities for the use of former plantation lands. And after conducting the interviews, I had some support with exploring a more Makavalu-inspired approach to decompose the components of these different interviews into their smallest parts and identifying keywords and themes, and then also building back out and identifying within and across interviews some key themes that were arising. And I'll be happy to share at least some of those with you now. And so with respect to how people are describing their relationship to ʻāina, some of the key sub-themes were ones of kinship, as one interviewee explained, and in parentheses is the island on which this interview is based. We have that kinship with ʻāina. We just feel ʻāina. You can feel when she's happy, when she's sad, when she's not having it. And people also often described how their health is mirrored in that of ʻāina. Without the ability to relate to and care for the rest of our earth and our land, it's psychologically painful and disconnecting. And so people, again, this is probably pretty familiar with people in this room, but just have this deep kinship with ʻāina and see themselves in it. People also talked extensively about resource stewardship and a focus on strengthening their connections to ʻāina through time and practice. It wasn't necessarily, well, some of us, especially at if you're at a government level, might be interested in the food production potential of these kinds of cultural restoration systems, as this quote kind of differentiates that the food we're growing in this space is a byproduct of the work we're trying to do with our community. Our mission is about growing and repairing these Kānaka ʻāina relationships. So really thinking about how they're, yes, producing food and supporting community in that regard, which is critical here in this island setting, but also really thinking about how they're building that connection across community and back to ʻāina, and how that's hopefully going to feed generations to come. There was also a lot of emphasis on grounding their stewardship practices in ʻike kupuna and all of the knowledge that came before them, and that a key part of this cultural revitalization is understanding the process of our kupuna and what they went through to generate knowledge and practice. And so this particular conversation was really emphasizing how methods like kilo can be these close observations of the environment, and how we think about the questions that we ask, and how that's informed by a kilo-based approach, how that can be informative and still applied in this context, even with all of the different changes we've seen in the climate and social and political dynamics, that some of those methodologies exist and persist as forms of restoring and rebuilding a new understanding of how we can move forward into the future in stewarding ʻāina. Just a couple key points from when people discuss their priorities for land use on former plantation lands. People really emphasize cultural restoration, biocultural restoration in general, which wasn't a surprise given their association with that kind of work, but of course, really wanting it to be guided by ʻāina and community. As you know, this quote really highlights the ike of each site is specific because of the history there, the climate there, the priorities there, and the people there. And so really digging deep into allowing each of the different areas where there's former plantation land, allowing the communities to take the lead in those restoration efforts and drawing on their ancestral knowledge and their needs as a community today and into the future. And then also kind of unprompted, people often brought up kipuka a lot as a kind of common word. And so as a society, we've got to get better at fortifying the intact areas, creating a kipuka grid instead of the electric grid. So for those not familiar, here's the definition pulled from the dictionary. But, you know, people, when they think about kipuka in like an ecological context, might think about the, you know, early establishment of the beginnings of a future forest on a new lava field. But it's interesting with people discussing kipuka in, you know, with such frequency in these conversations and thinking about opportunities, whether it's these gulches that are, you know, have persisted in areas with slightly higher water between the sort of tables that were intensively cultivated with sugarcane and pineapple, and how we might regrow out of those areas in terms of biocultural restoration, or this active restoration efforts happening in different pockets across the ʻāina, and how we can grow back like socially and cultural communities and ecological communities out of those different kipuka. There are many barriers to this kind of biocultural restoration that were discussed. You know, some of the key sub-themes focused on challenges with access to ʻāina. Old capital was Kānaka and ʻāina. Today there's limited ʻāina, and Kānaka are disconnected from it. So really, this kind of goes back to some of that plantation era and all that's followed it in terms of just like fully displacing people from ʻāina physically, or just limiting the sort of economic opportunities for people to, and I guess this very socioeconomic structure that reinforces and disincentivizes kind of having those kinds of relationships, and how that plays a key role in whether or not this is feasible going forward into the future. And then, of course, housing and educational opportunities were another key point, as highlighted in this last quotation. Education programs can add labor, but you need employees and they need housing. I think the potential to have housing that's tied to agricultural areas is important. It's a kind of kauhale model. So again, thinking about how these models and our understanding of ways of living collectively that persisted for centuries in the past could be applied in a way on a more modern context as a way of moving forward. And there's a lot to dig into, and I'm not a policy expert on housing, but you know, even in my limited understanding, I know we're constantly balancing situations in which people take advantage of agriculturally zoned areas and subdivide them or create what become known as like gentlemen's estates or some things of that nature, in which there's not really agriculture happening on agricultural land. It's really just a nice house on a big lot with maybe a horse or something like that. But that presents a barrier into why people, whether or not people support opportunities for housing on other areas where there would be genuine types of lo'i restoration or mala restoration. And without that kind of opportunity, people really dug deep into discussing how they can't, you know, commute from Hilo to Waipio to tend to their lo'i after they've done their 9 to 5. And, you know, there's a lot of things to unpack there that, you know, are not simple, but that was the crux of a lot of the barriers that people were facing. At the end of the interviews, I gave people opportunities to also comment on maps with respect to their priority areas. And so this is just an example of that activity. Like someone from Oahu, like myself, who's most familiar with this island, would have, they could fully decline, as you'll see in the final bullet. But they've had the opportunity. These are like 5 kilometer grids around former plantation lands, and they have 10 points they could put all 10 in one square where they think this is where biocultural restoration is a top priority, or they could distribute it evenly and in any of those areas on a given island. They had opportunities if you were, say, living on Oahu now for several years, but you grew up on Kauai for a decade, they could comment on both. They weren't restricted. I kind of let them self kind of regulate where they were gonna, which they were gonna comment on. And as is noted in the bottom point, a few of these were instances in which interviews happened on the phone or on Zoom, in which it was kind of difficult, but nonetheless, several people, only about half of the participants decided to participate in this activity. People were often citing for not choosing to participate, even if they've lived on Oahu their whole life. They're just like, I'm from Waianae and I don't want to comment on like North Shore or anywhere else, and that's not my place, or feeling that it's culturally misaligned, in which all ʻāina is being important and therefore I don't want to comment on this at all. And I, of course, respect those perspectives. I mean, and you can agree or disagree with any of those. I think, this activity, especially from my perspective, is not intended to, and this research as a whole is not intended to say any one piece of ʻāina is more important than others. But obviously, as we see with our various kipuka popping up, it's like, you still make decisions about where you choose to start ultimately, and you can't do everywhere at once. And so part of this activity was intended, and the research was intended to think about how we can bring community voices into thinking about where you might start thinking about biocultural restoration. And so the results from those who commented, darker areas in darker red illustrate areas that were indicated as having higher importance by people within a given, who commented on a given county, modern county of Hawaii. And so things that I think are illustrated and were vocalized both in the interviews and in conducting these activities were a desire to distribute opportunities across different moku. So again, wanting to create these and it aligns with what was coming up with Kipuka, like creating these opportunities for different communities to rebuild in their respective areas and allow communities to take the lead. But also there were areas that were of high cultural importance near Nāwaiʻeha on Maui and near Waipiʻo, where people, are just familiar with those areas and their cultural significance or their abundance of water resources and how that plays a role in the feasibility of biocultural restoration. And yeah, Lahaina is not particularly dark in this. That's partly, I think, due to the limited Maui participation and just as a result, some skew in like those who did participate, like how they allocated resources. Again, thinking about the two common being like two common philosophies expressed in these interviews being wanting to create opportunities in all the different mopu for communities to grow back, or I know that I'm here, I know the community is ready here, or I know we have a lot of cultural significance and importance, or a lot of water availability, and therefore this is a value, or where I would prioritize. So yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask why the Kualoa Ranch area on Oahu was not part of the grid?
So this area focused on former sugarcane and pineapple fields. To my knowledge, I don't know that there was an abundance of those. You might be able to correct me if there were in that area. And so I didn't focus as much on pasture land. And then there also might be some areas that just fall out of it, like certain areas where there was just not a lot of former plantation land and maybe they had to like occupy a certain amount of this 5-kilometer grid for one to persist. And so that was a decision that was made in some cases. And then the focus on sugarcane and pineapple, legacies being another area, and then also areas that have some of these areas, these former plantation lands that aren't being actively managed. But yeah. Yeah, so it was just interesting to think about getting people to participate in this type of mapping activity as a way of potentially expressing their priority areas beyond the interviews. Kind of in the final stage of this research, my goal was to try to bridge together these different schools of knowledge and the methodologies that they contain. This very cursory map kind of illustrates just a subset of those areas that were highly prioritized from the previous figure I showed, and how they do or don't overlap with that first analysis that was more just computationally GIS driven. And so there are instances of areas that are of mutual priority across those approaches, but also a lot of areas that are missed. And so that's just another illustration of the trade-offs and the hopefully potential benefit of bringing these kinds of data and methods into conversation with each other. And one way I worked on doing that was by identifying criteria that arose through the interview conversations. And once this is kind of focusing on instances that were more spatially representable, because that made it easier to bring into conversation with the first approach I showed, in which it was driven by more GIS type data. And so there's limitations to that and opportunities to think about how we could better bring together these perspectives from communities into this type of analysis. So there was a lot of focus on prioritizing areas that are proximate to community, and given the knowledge and role often in cultural restoration, I focused on a couple of approaches to identifying areas that might be proximate to community, whether that's areas with a higher percentage of Hawaiian representation in recent census data, or areas within a couple kilometers of Hawaiian homelands that would have greater accessibility. There's also a lot of emphasis on areas close to water. There's potentially certainly better ways to do this, but one of the ways I did it that was more straightforward to do was to identify forward plantation lands that are within a certain radius of perennial streams. And then the last potential source of input was from that mapping activity that I had interviews participate in which areas that were met a certain threshold for being highly rated as priority areas in that mapping activity were identified as well. And so where 3 of these 4 criteria overlapped with that first approach that was more the institutional academic approach to land use planning, was one way of bringing together potential priority areas for bioculture restoration. Again, recognizing that this isn't the only place where it's happening, where it can happen or should happen. But I think one of the main takeaways I like to highlight about this work, or that I think is of value, hopefully, is moving towards finding ways of bringing community voices into these types of land use planning efforts in general, hopefully having community knowledge, cultural knowledge inform that type of decision-making or planning effort. And I overlaid with this, as noted on the bottom, like Natalie Kuroshima's modeled areas of where there would be suitable climate and conditions for different types of traditional agriculture in the broad categories that she used. But again, I tread lightly with this because maps hold a lot of power and can be misused. And I'm thinking critically about when and how to share this, but this is a type of space where I also appreciate opportunities to receive a lot of questions and feedback. And I'll kind of have a few more slides to wrap up. So just to summarize, there's, some of the takeaways for me and hopefully for you were that bioculture restoration is a priority on foreign plantation lands and really focusing on reconnecting people with ʻāina, thinking about restoring kipuka, especially in areas close to community and wai, and also hopefully identifying ways in which we can bridge methodologies and knowledge systems to center community voices and knowledge and thinking about land stewardship. Some ways that I'm trying to think about how we go forward from here. I mean, for one, this is a really computationally driven ʻāina wide analysis. Like, how do you translate it into changes of restoration and stewardship on the scale of a given parcel or even an ahupua or a moku? And so that's definitely something we need to keep thinking about. And also thinking about how we can create the sort of social and cultural conditions that support these community-led biocultural restoration efforts, whether that's through policies that better incentivize collaborations or agreements to access land, especially for these community-led restoration efforts, and also opportunities when people have access to land to lower barriers for access, particularly thinking about opportunities for housing and supporting long-term leases. That was another thing I didn't mention earlier, but often came up was challenges even on a 3 or 5 year lease with thinking about planting an ulu tree or an ulu grove in which you're not going to see the fruit of. And if you're unsure whether or not you'll get your lease renewed, it could lead you to make some difficult decisions about how much you're going to invest, how you choose to allocate your time and effort in the time you have that lease. I'll kind of close with these next few slides to highlight some of the things I'm thinking about now, just because I'm so new here. Hopefully there's opportunities. I've already started to have conversations with some of you here about what I think are cool opportunities for further research and collaboration. And also whether or not you're doing this kind of work, but if you know people who are grad students or faculty or community members, I'll definitely be interested in being put in touch. So kind of started to get at this maybe, but how does this exactly translate to restoration effort on the ground? And more specifically, how do we think about diving more into these types of registered maps from the more Mahele era? How do these traditional uses and the relationships that communities have retained with them inform, restoration going into the future? This is just the overlay in Lahaina, kind of highlighting the diversity of different kuleana and not really shown, but a range of land use types from lokoi'a to malaulu and other types of land cover. How do we think about bringing some of that diversity and cultural significance back to these former plantation lands to move past some of those legacies of harm? I kind of started to mention this. I mentioned the little bit of work I'd done on the piece with Clay and others following the fires in Lahaina. We discuss a lot about the potential for biocultural restoration as a mitigation strategy for future fires, but haven't done a ton of work in actually identifying, for example, as an extension of this work, where there might be priority areas, especially informed by community knowledge, to think about bioculture or priority areas specifically to mitigate fire risk. In light of recent flooding events in my community and in many communities across Hawaii, I'm thinking a lot about, and again, having recent conversations about this, and it's been on my mind of like the proximity of some of these areas that are really susceptible to burning with also flood risk and how that might interrelate and or exacerbate each other. That's another thing I'm thinking a lot about. And so definitely interested in having conversations, especially kind of in a timely manner, to think about like ways to move forward and hopefully create opportunities to do some highly relevant work that also is directly beneficial to community, hopefully. And I think I got rid of the slide here, but the next one was going to just also think about how people talk a lot about like kipuka, but creating these little pockets of restoration and biocultural restoration across the landscape. How do we kind of hopefully move beyond those kipuka and improve connectivity for habitat for species, or just like, as we know, stewardship happening on the ahupua or really moku type scales? Like, how do you go from a handful of acres or even kind of a bigger 80 acre, 100 acre kind of scope to that broader management and kind of having conversations and the He'i and Nur is such a great model for, in the modern context, what that could look like, and how do we bring that to moku scales to other areas across the Pai'aina. And there's other initiatives, the Ahupua Accelerated Initiative and others that are happening that are doing great work kind of related to that. But yeah, all to the many different communities, collaborators, and assistance I've received, as well as funding sources. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Appreciate your time.
Mahalo Nākoa, and I just want to say, please get food, and I'm sorry that the serving utensils, we had one of our top people on our team is gone, so we don't have a serving utensil, but get food. I'll stop talking now.
I'm just curious about the old capital that was there in Lahaina town. You know, they did a lot of digging of it several years ago, and then they reburied it. Is there any opportunity for them to open that and make it into a cultural site where people can actually go and see it, the first capital of the,
Yeah, that's a great question.
Cleared out all that area.
Yeah, I'm, I would love to see that. I can't speak personally into great detail about, I suspect there's definitely community members that might be interested in, I know there's broad interest and probably within the community in, again, like thinking about opportunities, this unfortunate event, but potential opportunity to think about totally restoring and reimagining a future in which there's a lot more of this culturally informed stewardship. But of course, there still is a lot of barriers to that. And how do you honor things like the former capital of Hawaiʻi in Lahaina in a way that hopefully, and you weren't suggesting this, but yeah, doing it in such a way that doesn't end up being like a tourist attraction so much as hopefully being a hub of a reminder of the excellence of the kingdom, but also hopefully like inspiring some great stewardship and care around it.
Well, and even if it is a tourist attraction, it presents the Hawaiian culture of the historical component of that before it moved to Oahu. And people will learn about that because a lot of Invasive people don't know that it's there.
Totally, just preserving that knowledge.
Mention it in your interviews when you talk to the folks in Maui?
Yeah, those people didn't talk about that specifically. That there was definitely a lot of consideration for, there again was like 4 to 6 months removed from the fires in Lahaina when I was having those couple of conversations with people, and so definitely just thinking a lot. They were. Maybe it was the nature of the kinds of questions I was asking were a bit more focused again on like Malama ʻāina more specifically, and then necessarily cultural historical sites of that kind of nature that it just didn't arise as much. But yeah, I'd be interested in thinking more about that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Fantastic presentation. I was just picking up on that idea of the kipuka again. I wondered if you'd done any sort of spatial analysis of existing biocultural projects as kapuka themselves in proximity to those other areas you identified as potential priorities, noting not wanting to prioritize particular areas of ʻāina over others.
Yeah.
But I wondered if there was any correlation between existing projects and mapped out and the areas that you identified as well.
Yeah, that's one that I've been meaning to do and haven't done in great detail. Like I've done some more like spot checking of just like alignment, and that's definitely one thing that, again, part of it is due to the nature in which the decisions that get made in a modeling type framework that end up with that inform the kind of like smattering of areas that end up being prioritized that may or may not perfectly align with existing areas. But that's like a good way of checking. And then also, like you're saying, like I think a really cool type of next analysis to think about. Even if they don't overlap with as priority areas in this given model, like there's not, for better and worse, probably like a straight up map of like where the existing biocultural restoration efforts are. I'm sure one could scrape and like get a sense of those that have especially like a web interface to get a sense of the location. I guess that then you have trade-offs with, I don't know how much they want something like that conveyed, but nonetheless, it might be possible to do that kind of analysis without mapping where they are, sharing that if should it not be wanted, but understanding how that might integrate with priority setting as well. Yeah.
So I think you touched upon maybe a couple of examples of biocultural restoration that you've seen in action that worked. Are there other ones that you would highlight, like poster children for that sort of stuff? And then also as a sort of a follow-on to that one, are there places that just have all the right ingredients, but they haven't really been having this approach yet? That would be the low-hanging fruit if you choose them.
That's a great question. Well, there's some people in this room who are involved with efforts like Mala ʻŌiwi, which is like an community-led agroforestry network that's kind of still relatively young, but is doing some really great work. And so definitely there's members of that organization that are doing it. And, you know, in the case of these interviews, they weren't all people who are doing bioculture restoration on foreign plantation lands. Like obviously a lot of lokui'a might not necessarily be directly on a foreign plantation field or even like directly downstream of one. But again, we're still people who are familiar with that kind of the kind of biocultural stewardship in general. But there were instances of people several on Maui, several on Hawaiʻi Island along like the Hamakua coast, like Hui Mau is an excellent example in Koholalele, kind of near Pa'awilo like area on the Hamakua coast of Hawaiʻi Island, with Noeau Peralto and his hui are doing just excellent work always on foreign plantation lands. And that's what some of these pictures were from. They're kind of agroforestry restoration in the midst of all of the introduced kind of eucalyptus forests there. It's very much creating like pockets of opportunity. And also luckily, I mean, unsurprisingly, given their caliber of thinking and strategy, they've, as of a couple of years ago, started to get access to some bigger leases as well. Like they're doing some really great work. They're definitely a great example. But yeah, as far as prime areas where it could occur, I mean, I think there is already probably some good work happening kind of in and around the Nāwaiʻeha area on like the northeastern coast of Maui. Again, I guess there's a lot of history of water removal from some of those areas, but there's also a fair amount of like natural rain that falls there. And so factors like that, I think, to not try to just like, it's a great question, but I won't be able to rattle off like all the best examples that might exist. There's various types of layers you might consider with respect to like certain metrics of like soil quality, and then probably things like a balance of a pretty good amount of rainfall given like issues around water, I think being kind of prominent in decisions around it. I think areas where there's decent rainfall, and then ultimately access. I think that's another thing that I don't really dive deep into. I mean, I kind of discussed, but not the full depths of it with respect to like, I think the breakdown of the areas I was considering is about 60% public, but that's like federal and state and a fair amount of military. And so those in theory could be not necessarily military ones, but some of the other ones could be more accessible for potential partnerships if entities like the state are interested in the opportunities for things like biocultural restoration to achieve some of these different goals they've set out. So those are the alignment of access. Doesn't have to be public. In some cases, some entities, like some people have mixed, obviously, experiences with entities like KS, Kamehameha Schools, and others that have a lot of land assets as private landowners. Maybe more than others have some interest in seeing things like biocultural restoration happen, but also it's always just, it's an arm of Kamehameha Schools that also very much needs to consider its bottom line in terms of their land assets. So that's one that I just know some of these people are operating and leasing former or Kamehameha Schools land for cultural stewardship, but it's not always just a golden ride with that case either. So yeah. Oh.
I was just wondering if you would share what the economic model that could ideally work in this. Yeah. It's like, I really like that one of your interviewees say, you can have labor from education sector, but you need employed people. And like, so who would employ them?
Yeah, great question. I think that several people brought up, I didn't talk to anyone from this organization, but people mentioned Ma'o Farms on this island as a great model for that. I mean, they do great work in terms of their education and creating opportunities for students to get degrees while working with them and learning from them. And so I think people really look to that kind of model and as one strategy for providing the education, as well as like models for preparing people in a way that it becomes more economically feasible. But in that paper following the Lahaina fire, we talked some about like regenerative tourism approaches. There's, you know, things to consider and doing it in a way that feels like culturally sound or aligned. And with like policies like the green fee that you know, pass finally, that could create opportunities for revenue or like funding at a state level that can hopefully be directed to support that kind of employment. I think that there's a decent number of organizations that are starting to do that kind of work. And if there's pockets of funding from things like the green fee or other sources that support it, I think more will pop up, as well as those that exist will probably expand and be. I think it's more a challenge people face that I've gotten a sense of in these organizations, of feeling like they have the funding to fairly compensate their employees and retain them and recruit new people. And so hopefully funding sources like that, and you know, others have explored, and this is kind of, I guess, an aspect of regenerative tourism, is like different types of ecotourism. Like people give like tours of lo'i or things, and places like Kualoa, people go and like, I guess, walk in the lo'i for an hour. And I guess you kind of just have your mud patch, because it's not always good to have people walking in your lo'i throughout the growing season. But the people pay money to do that, and maybe they could actually get some work done. And there are models people are implementing of like just volunteer days that get people when they're visiting during the week to come. So different strategies. I think there's a couple questions online, and I'll be happy to take more in the break.
Okay, so the first question is, should there be more effort to restore other original landscapes of some of these ʻāina, such as Mokinia wetlands of Lahaina Maui? And what substitutes can be installed to help places like Kihei Maui, which are nearly totally developed?
Yeah. Great questions. Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about Lahaina. Like, I mean, I think that definitely this type of work has a lot of value to all across Hawaii, and especially in communities like that, where as some of my other work and ongoing interests have considered, like where there's opportunities to mitigate things like fire or potentially flooding. There's a lot of value, I think, and others in this room probably think, like in biocultural stewardship, to bring back some of those practices and you know, ancestral practices, and hopefully the connections of those individuals have connections to those communities. In more urban areas like Kihei, yeah, it's a great consideration. Or like there's some of the land considered in this analysis around like Ewa, and it's like those of us who go near Ewa, not to quickly jump away from Kihei, but it's like an example of another kind of urban developing landscape. Like, what role is it? I mean, I would see a lot of value in even just like, to the extent we can create those little kipuka in and among these urban areas. I think that there's definitely potential. And so those areas might have been excluded from some of this initial analysis, because I was mostly focusing on areas that were not urban developed, just again, as like the first step of understanding, like, you're not going to probably demolish a building, or like me saying that won't make it happen. It's a little easier to at least present the opportunity on a bit more of an open landscape to consider biocultural stewardship. So that's where I started. But it could be very interesting to think about the areas immediately surrounding some of those highly urban regions, and, you know, having conversations with people who dive deep into the wildland urban interface and its like role in fire risk. You know, those areas immediately around those highly urban settings are also really important to consider. And so I'm sure that'll be part of some of my future work too.
Next question. Haley says, I'm interested in what you said about how maps can be potentially misused or misinterpreted. Can you dig into that a little bit more? What are some of your considerations when you publicly share maps? Assuming private lands and calling out particular land managers for their land use might be some considerations.
Yeah. I mean, this work, and this, I mean, partly because it's ʻāina wide doesn't dive too deep into like individual landowners, and there might have been an era where there was an era where a lot of land was held in even bigger entities, and so it was maybe even more straightforward too. But if you some of the more recent maps of private landowners, while still some of them have large tracts of land, is quite diverse, and so it's a little more challenging to call people out, or unless you're focusing on more specific areas. But considerations, of course, just some people may or may not want their areas to be known on a map for various reasons. There's risks of over tourism if you're mapping things like cultural sites, which wasn't really the focus here, but there was a time I considered thinking about how that might play a role in priority setting of like proximity to culturally important sites, but it didn't end up playing into here. It doesn't mean you have, even if you include that type of thing in your analysis, it doesn't have to be like an end product to share something like that. And definitely just it's an ongoing thought process and conversation, and kind of varies with each data set with respect to like how appropriate it is to share in general, and where and how to set like the appropriate restrictions with access, whether that's to view or certainly to like downloading and use for different purposes. But someone could possibly take the absence of either the presence of for example, in this case, seeing biocultural restoration as a priority. If it's not in their area, they might be like, oh, well, then it doesn't have to happen here, or it shouldn't happen here. While maybe some of my goal with this was to highlight opportunities where some of these organizations could, for example, write a grant that might draw on the potential insight from a study like this that hopefully supports their interests and efforts to pursue cultural restoration.
Last question, or a couple more. Allison says, has there been any conversations with owners of former plantation lands, and if so, what's their responses been?
Yeah, that was something I thought about and didn't end up really doing. It's one that I'll probably revisit in the future. I didn't end up talking to any former plantation like owners or managers. I mean, again, some of that's changed a lot, like a lot of it's changed hands. I think there's maybe opportunities, or one of the better opportunities if they respond will be in like central Maui, just given its recency and still kind of persistence in some type of agriculture and maybe some institutional knowledge that's being preserved. But some of these other entities have like disassociated, and not to say it's impossible, but it's just a bit more hard to track them down. And yeah.
Lily says, in cases like the dam and ditch built by Dole that have drastically changed the way that the land functions, does restoration of these areas mean bringing them back to how the land looked before, or would it be a different approach?
Yeah, great question. Restoration is always a question of what are you restoring to, and so that's ultimately kind of in the hands of the community. Well, I guess whoever's in the decision-making role, but in my preference or through this type of work, would love to see communities be part of that decision. And the position of this type of work was exploring, I guess, the era in the centuries preceding plantations to the best of our knowledge, like what might have existed or been, what would have the ecological and climate been suitable for, as well as diving deeper into some of those registered map records. How do the records of those types of land uses inform what we might want? And so again, it's going to vary based on the individual with respect to like what they would like to see, and what a little harder to, but possible maybe to try to reconstruct like not all of these areas were mala or like lo'i. Probably most of them weren't, and that's another thing that came up in these conversations, is thinking about just how you go about restoring these lands in reforesting them in a way that's like important for the water retention and like the ecohydrological cycles that these plantation legacies have really disrupted. Yeah.
Yeah.
You go first.
So like what you're just saying, like, so the study is focused on abandoned plantation lands. So a lot of these areas aren't associated with mala indigenous practices really that people know of. And I feel like overall, like there's a massive challenge there. These areas are like areas that people aren't connected with. largely like inaccessible. And so I was wondering if that's like a big thing that you felt like it's really important to be thinking about these areas, but like no one has like deep personal stewardship level connections with them. So like it seems like that's a big barrier that needs to be overcome to like bring communities into it.
Yeah, it's a great point. And thinking about restoring that connection through ʻāina, and like especially it's like one thing in some areas just due to the landscape, maybe like some of those guys I mentioned, Huimau and Pa'uila, like just maybe there's families and people who've remained in closer proximity, but then these were such vast agricultural complexes that people got like pushed away from, displaced from, that like, rekindling that relationship to land and understanding of what practices preceded the plantations and understanding what's feasible today. That's another thing I didn't really mention explicitly here, is like the what's it called? Like not revitalization, but even just like handling all of the like residual agrochemicals and like rehabilitation of the landscape is another consideration on top of all of this, that this type of model doesn't currently integrate in a deep way. And so it's a great point with respect to people needing to create opportunities for people to reconnect with some of these lands, and maybe that will further inform and change how the kinds of findings from this type of study in thinking about where priorities exist as people have opportunities to restore that connection. But
like areas that kind of need a new story, right?
Yeah, and another conversation I'm recalling is just from these interviews was people really talking about spending time observing like ʻāina today before you even make decisions, and thinking about like what you're restoring to, like really spending just time there before you even are taking action, and understanding the flows of water or the plants there, among other factors. So yeah.
Are you feeling exhausted by questions yet? But
No, I'm good.
Thank you for your talk. That was really
Yeah, of course.
interesting and thought-provoking. I think it's great that you kind of opened up mapping as surfaces of engagement, or just ways for people to think about these questions. For the prioritization, what was the question you asked people? Like where do you feel like is ready, or like where?
It was like, where would you prioritize bioculture restoration on?
So pretty open, so kind of letting
Yeah.
them think about them, because it could be interesting to think about
Where it's ready, or
because it's the question. I think it's interesting to do it both ways, because with the way you did it, it's more open-ended, but you could see the answer being different for like where is funding most needed versus where are they most ready, versus like even where would you get the most food production? They might have a more local context. So it just seems really interesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then my other side question was, do you think if you used a different spatial scale, it would have been different too? Like rather than grids, like using a moku or a hupua scale, and why was there a reason to choose that? Was it just the patchiness of the plantation?
No, it's a great questions. I mean, the first one I guess is more like we had a quick back and forth on. Like I think it'd be great to think about rephrasing the questions, how that plays a role in it. I know one interview was talking about, I think the ultimate decided not to do the mapping activity, was just like, well, if there's a map of like where like basically Hawaiian communities are and where, where they're ready, then that just like doesn't really exist. And like that's like what would have ultimately informed where that person would have chosen to put their priorities. But different spatial scale. I was of course thinking about it as I'm like entering this room of biocultural researchers, and especially people thinking at moku type scales. I was like, this is it's just the nature of this first effort, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think one, like you're not supposed to, I guess, talk about your flaws or whatever in your research talks, but just like one limitation of it is like it really started from a point of the more like institutional academic approach, as opposed to how do you start it from the point of the registered map or something else, whether it's the registered map or the contemporary community as like the starting point, and then you can bring in if you want to, you could consider bringing in the approach that more of the spatial planners down in the government might align with, but have that be the basis. And kind of talked around your question there too, but yeah, it's to say I think part of it was the passionate of the fields and where I approached it from, but I have thought recently about how it would be cool to start from a different, more like ʻŌiwi based grounding, and to apply those kinds of socio-cultural land divisions to the framing too.
Yeah, that's great. Creates opportunities for thinking.
Yeah.
Because of weather problems and resource limitations these days, on ag land, is it does using of technology like greenhouses and hydroponics conflict with cultural values for scaling up food production?
Yeah. I think people will have different perspectives on that, and I guess some people use it for like for raising their young plants, for example. Maybe that might be less ready to weather the storms, but yeah, I guess it's like the use of those tools. I don't think people are necessarily averse to, but I guess it would be kind of different to have acres and acres of just like greenhouse taro production versus like mala or things like that, and how you go about it. But it is a real consideration with respect to like even broader how we understand the biocultural landscape to have existed before. I've talked to people who talk a lot more about the just opportunistic nature of like things like lo'i, where it's just like, you have part of a stream that like spills over, and like that was just like, that little area was like a great spot to throw some huli in the ground, and that was that. And then you also have what we see more of, like possibly related to the rice paddy era, maybe existed in certain areas of just these like huge networks of lo'i that are like really well defined as a landscape. And is it kind of building on your question, is it like culturally aligned to have like monoculture, like mass, like dryland taro that exists in some places or things like that? Isn't even, just another aspect of that too. But yeah, Katie.
So do you have any plans to translate this into policy or get this research into the hands of policymakers? And if so, how do you plan to do that?
Great question. It was a nervous laugh. Not a laugh of like, how could you imagine that? I am not a policy trained person. It's one I'd love to collaborate with people who think about things like that on a really deep way. I mean, I've dabbled in some of the opinion piece following the fires, and others in some of, and what I've talked to some extent today about thinking about regenerative tourism and things like that. It's like kind of easier to talk about in these broad strokes, but to like dive deep into like what does the policy look like. Having just started here, I've talked to some people doing some really great work down at the Capitol and things, and so I think it'd be great to learn from people like that, whether or not it's something that just to try it and to see at some point, and to see if it's something I feel like I can directly be involved with, or identify people who can like support translating some of the types of research I'm thinking about into that.
Any other questions? Questions online? No. All right. Well, please join me in thanking Nākoa for our next seminar is April 8th. I'll be back with Ron Bave. And what's the title of his presentation?
Ideas of Fiji's indigenous culturally protected aquatic areas.
Awesome. Hope you join us. We will have serving spoons next time and more tofu. Thanks, Nākoa.